does Christ in us affect one another? And so he's going to go through what I think is 3 different levels of relationship. If you're married, I'll just say this. So a lot of times I get asked to do counseling for married couples specifically. And whenever a married couple is typically going through something, it's sometimes hard to keep your eye on the ball. You know what I'm saying? So as a counselor, I'm going to tip my hand to you guys. If you ever call me for counseling, you're going to get this. I'm so sorry. I have like 2 tools. I got a hammer and a flathead screwdriver. That's all I get to use sometimes. If you don't have those problems, you need to call somebody else. So a lot of times, what I find is that, when couples are having problems, it's like watching a hockey match is the best play. Have you ever watched a hockey game where you just can't keep your eye on where the puck is? Where'd it go? It's little bitty. The camera angle is just wrong, and you can't find the puck, and you're like, who has this thing? That's why I don't watch hockey. I'm not a big fan, because I can't find the puck, right? Well, sometimes when married couples are having problems, my job is to find the puck. And once I find it, it's like, okay, there it is. And I'm listening to them, and just keep my eye on the puck, because that's the problem. And then after they have talked around it and really made the puck not the issue, I go, okay, let's just see if this is the issue. And I usually do this analogy. I said, what I want you to do, and if I've ever done this with you, I'm so sorry. Trust me, I'm not exposing anything. I'll put 5 things on a piece of paper. I'll randomly write out 5 things. I write out hobbies, work, God, children, and your spouse. I'll write those 5 words and I'll say, okay, in your heart and in your mind, I want you to prioritize these as to not how they should be, but how they actually are in your life. And they'll start, most people aren't really honest. Okay, just be honest. Most people want to lie because they want to come out, because they see and they get it instantly like, oh, crud. Oh, okay, I see where you're going now, Wilson. And so we kind of have to get to some honesty. We have to make them be honest. And I tell them to do it in your head, because sometimes it's embarrassing. They'll write it down, and I'm like, that's embarrassing. And then I'll go, okay, now how should this be? And they'll start to order things, right? They'll order God first, because that's what and I tell them, I said, let's order this how the Bible orders this. We'll put God first, because that's what the Bible does. And I say, okay, what's the next thing in your life, your next ministry? What's the next thing that should be? And they'll put my spouse. I'm like, good, that's right. I'm like, then what's next? And they'll go, my kids. A lot of times this gets flipped. A lot of times parents want to put their kids first and not their wife or their husband. But when we look at the Bible text, we do it. So we go, God. Okay, now we got husband, wife. Now we got kids. Now what's next? And then I got 2 choices, hobbies or work. All right? I don't care about these at this point. I throw those in to mess people up. But typically, we go work is next, right? Because, we, as God told Adam to cultivate the garden, make it better, right? Grow this thing, make this world better. So we go work, right? And then we play. We put hobbies at the end. Because if you put hobbies above work, you're going to be broke, right? And that affects your family, and that affects your spouse. And I don't know if that affects your relationship with God, but it might. You see how we do? Because these are the different levels of how our relationship with the Lord. And what I always do is I said, this is what we call trickle-down economics. When your relationship with God is where it should be. In verse 15 it says that let the peace of Christ rule in your heart. And last week we talked about that word rule is the word to umpire. It's the word to, like an umpire umpires a baseball game. He calls the ball. That's a ball, don't swing at it. That's a string the decisions for us. Take your base. When He is ruling in our heart, making the decisions for us, it's trickle-down economics, right? It affects how we relate to our spouses, correct? Have you ever had a moment when you and your wife or you and your husband have just been, boom? I mean, it's like emotional and verbal blows at one another. If you stop to think in that moment, have you and Christ been just like the best of pals? Are y'all the closest of friends? Of course not. Of course not. You're in your flesh, right? So what happens is when God is in His proper place, when He is ruling in our heart and in our life, it trickles down to our relationship with our husbands and wives. It trickles down to our relationships with our kiddos, correct? How we handle our kiddos, how we deal with our children, and how our children see us, how they respond to us is completely different when Christ is the head of our home and of our heart. And then we go down into our workplace, right? What happens in our workplace? Relationships are changed. The way we respond as a subordinate, it's changed. The way we respond to our bosses changes, doesn't it? No matter what, if they're believers or not, doesn't matter, right? Because Christ is ruling. Things are different. Okay, so I stop right there because that's where we are in this text. Our mind has been changed. Our heart has been changed. Now let me ask you this. We talked about last week, we are new creations, but is there still the struggle to get this right? Till you die. Till you die. If you're young in this room, I want you to find somebody with gray hair. I want you to find somebody that kind of walks with a little limp, maybe hunched over a little bit. Find one of those brothers or sisters, and I want you to ask them this question. Do you still struggle with your flesh? You know what they're going to say? They're going to look you in the eye and they're going to go, no, what's wrong with you? No, I'm just kidding. They're going to go, oh, every day I have to put on Christ. Every day I have to set my mind on things above. Every day I have to die to my flesh and be hidden in Christ every day. We're not going to get out of it, right? But we can see victory as we walk in the light. That's what we talked about last week, walking in the light, staying close to Christ. So now let's look at how this is affected. How does Christ affect our relationships? Let's look at the text. Go to verse 18 is where we are. So if you have your info sheet, the first thing, the level one that you're going to see is Christ affects our marital relationship. I'm just walking down the list, right? I'm just walking through. We've already established Christ as head. He is the ruler. Now let's look at this. The level one ministry that we have on this earth is to our spouse. It's to our spouse. Look at the text. Super simple. Wives, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. So here's what I want you to write in your little blanks here. Wives can submit to their husbands without bitterness. And when does that happen? When Christ rules. When Christ rules, wives can submit to their husbands without bitterness. So I want to explain this. If Christ isn't ruling, in other words, if we're not putting on Christ, if we're not being who we were created to be, the new creation you are, the prince, the princesses that we are created to be, if we're not being that, if we're not accepting that as our reality, and we're living in the flesh, can wives submit to their husbands without bitterness? It's very, very hard. Because at that point, submission is seen as a bad thing, isn't it? All you got to do is walk out these doors, and just the tenor of our society right now, we have created what is known as a role-less society. It's not coming. We're not on the horizon of it. It is here. We live in a role-less society. But that's not how the Bible created things. You go back to Genesis chapter 2, and you see the introduction of the husband and the wife together, the first marriage. That's not how God designed it. And guess what? And it doesn't work. It never works. A role-less marriage doesn't work. And because when Christ doesn't rule, guess what happens? Submission is redefined to be inferiority. That's what it's defined as. And that's what our world sees it as. It's also defined as the idea of being less than, or a servitude, or servility, to be a servant to the husband as opposed to submission. Now let me ask you a question. Do you submit yourself to the government? Yes, you do. Are you the doormat of the government? No, you're not. Are you less than, or valued less than, a senator or a congressman in our world? Maybe, right? Are you supposed to be? No. Why? Because our Constitution says that we are a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, right? But does that mean that you don't submit? Of course not. How many of you, raise your hand if you like I'm just kidding, the president. Just kidding, don't do that. That was a joke. So let's just compare the last two presidents, okay? Because both of those guys are like opposites of one another, all right? Some of you really like our current president. And some of you really liked the last president. I don't care, all right? We're not a 501c3, so I can actually say whatever I want. But I don't care. But here's the point. If you didn't like the last guy, did you submit? We did, right? You submit. Why? Because that's our role too. If you don't, what do you have? Anarchy, right? You have destruction. You have rioting when you don't submit. So you don't like the guy we got now. Are you submitting? Do you submit? We do, right? We know that in 4 years things can change. Or 8 years things can change. It happens. That's the beauty of our government. We don't have to depend on the fact that this guy's going to be in there for 30 years and ruin everything. Nope, 4 years, 8 years, he's gone. We can get somebody else in. That's exactly what happened this last time, right? It happens every 4 to 8 years. Go back in history. We're constantly rebalancing the scales. But my point is this, at every turn, what do we do as citizens? We submit. Does that mean that we're less than or more inferior? It does not. So the point that I'm trying to make is that there is almost a conspiracy would be a great word towards the things of God when it comes to the role of the wife in the marriage. Now the reason I say this is all done. Notice how he puts the text. The text it doesn't say husbands love your wives. That's verse 19, right? It doesn't say husbands love your wives first and then say wives submit to your husbands. Notice how he stacked it. He just started out with wives first. Why do you think that is? It's because, wives, your role is not contingent on who your husband is or how he is. Isn't that amazing? But notice, this is when Christ is hidden in our hearts, when Christ is ruling. That's how this works. Now, I want to be real sensitive here. I want to be very sensitive here. Because ladies, if you've got a husband who is a tyrannical jerk, I feel for you. You do not have it easy. There is nothing easy that I can say about this. I'm not saying something that is necessarily going to make you feel better about your husband. But notice this, when he calls us to love, he calls us to an agape love, doesn't he? He doesn't call us to just a selfish eros love, just getting from me. He calls us to an agape love, right? And that love doesn't matter it doesn't care if that husband's worthy or not. Now watch this. It's about to flip on us, okay? Look at let me share this too, and I want to say this. Reason I can make the case that we're not talking about inferiority when we talk about submission. Reason I can make the case that we're not talking about servitude when we talk about submission, that we're talking about honoring the leadership and the authority that God has placed in power, all right? The reason I can say that is because in Galatians, he tells the church at Galatia the same thing. This will be on the screen. This is chapter 3, verse 26 through 28. He says, "For you all are sons of God through faith in Jesus Christ." Speaking of everybody. He says, "We are all sons of God." Verse 27, "For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free man. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ." Does Christ value men over women? Of course not. Does God value Trump over you? Of course not. In Christ we are one. That's why the last section of verses that we went through talked about how Jews or Greeks, slaves or free man, we are now brothers. He took enemies and made them brothers, right? We are one, so your value doesn't change. That's how we know that this is not speaking to your worth. Okay, so now let's go to the next point. So the second level that is affected in level 1, the second thing that's affected is obviously the relationship of the husband towards the wife. The husbands, when Christ rules, the husbands can love their wives without anger. Without anger. Now put the word anger in here because that's exactly what happens when husbands aren't loving their wives in Christ. We get mad. It's just a default. I don't know why it is. Most guys tend to have an angry bone. We tend to be, when we get frustrated, we tend to run towards anger. And anger is just a masking emotion. It's not a real emotion. It's masking other things like fear or loss or things like that. But that's what we do. Look at your text. In verse 19, it says, husbands are to love their wives and do not be embittered against them. The word embittered is pikrano, and it means to be angry. Husbands must be known for our love, not for our anger. You ever see a man on a battlefield? You ever been on a battlefield? When guys get together, testosterone and aggression begins to drive us, right? We were at the men's why are y'all laughing? The men's thing on Thursday night. We had some competition. And our aggression began to drive us, right? It's just a bunch of guys around each other. It was fun. Fellas, would you have wanted your wives in the midst of those men on Thursday night? With all of the double entendres that were flying around? No, you would not, right? Why? Because we get into a place when we're just together. You stick a guy, my wife used to call this boy world. When we would get married, and all of a sudden, this guy that she didn't really know was around, and he became this thing. She called it boy world. We don't want to be boy world guys forever. Not with our wives, right? There's a tenderness and an emotional connection and intimacy that she needs, that we must give. Just like we need the respect, we need the honor, she needs the love. Look at Ephesians 5. He says the exact same thing about husbands to the church at Ephesus. Husbands, love your wives. He says it to the church at Colossae, he says it to the church at Ephesus. But notice how he says it differently. And don't be embittered and don't be angry towards them, he says this, you're to love her as Christ loved the church. He goes into this whole thing about how Christ loved the church in Ephesians 5, 25, 26, 27. He goes into how Christ gave himself for her. Setting her up apart, washing her, the church, with the water of the Word, cleaning her with His own words. You see how that is? That's who we're to be. So watch this. This is all stuff, notice I put in the phrase, can happen. Does this happen? Is this happening? That's for you and your husband to sit down, maybe tonight, over a cup of coffee, decaf so you can go to bed, and talk about it, right? And have a conversation. Why is this not happening? Is Christ the ruler here? So that's level 1. Let me give you, Tim Keller has a great quote about this, about how we are to love as spouses. He says, our culture says that feelings of love are the basis for actions of love. Okay, stop and think about that. That in order to act like I love you, I have to feel like I love you. Now, that is sometimes true, correct? When I do feel like I love you, I obviously respond. But is that consistent? It's not, is it? He says, and of course that can be true. But it is truer to say that actions of love can lead consistently to the feelings of love. Man, what a great text, right? What a great phrase to say. The actions of love are more consistently lead us to the feelings of love. We need to think about that because that's what Christ is there to do. All right, let's look at the second level. So we've talked about how Christ affects this relationship between a husband and a wife. Now the husband can be the guy the wife needs. He can be, you know what's crazy? Me and Jolene talk about this a lot. We talk about how when Jesus to her, when I am like Christ to her, she is overjoyed to honor me. She is overjoyed. She wants to bring me honor. She wants to bring me respect because I am doing what I'm supposed to do. It's so much easier for her. And when I'm not, is she still called to do it? She is. Because guess what? It's not about my behavior. It's not about her behavior. It's about Christ in her. Right? Now let's look at the second level. So now how does this play out? Trickle-down economics. God, our relationship with Him, being hidden in Him, trickles down to our relationship with our husbands and our wives. And then it trickles down into the relationships that we have with our children. And when our children know Christ and love Him and are taught to love Him, not just to act right. We as parents often teach our kids to act right, but to understand the heart behind why we are doing what we're doing. That is to be out of love. When our kids know that and when we respond to our kids, something changes. Again, when Christ is ruling. So let's look at the parent-child relationship and how Christ affects that. The first thing you're going to see is for children, when Christ rules, children can obey their parents without understanding. Do you remember being a kid? Think back. Some of you, you're going to have to go back to some serious gray matter. You're going to have to find it. Find that memory of being a kid. I don't know about you, but I can remember it because I'm so childlike, right? I can remember being a child, and the thing that frustrated me the most with them. Hey guys. The thing that always brought me the most frustration as a child was when I didn't understand why. Because I'm that kid. I have to understand it. This is what we call, you ever find the kid that has to experience life in order to get it? They're called rogue children, right? They don't listen to your words. They have to go touch the stove with their hand. That's hot, Chris. Sure it is. I can remember, I've told this story before. I remember I was probably 3. It was when we lived in the Rock House, so I was like 4 maybe. And 4 or 5, and I can remember it. I remember it because it's seared into my mind. Mom makes cookies. She pulls them out. I'm like, yeah! And I run to let's do this. And this is why you made them, for my joy, right? And I run to her, and she's like, no. She sits them on top of the stove. The cookie sheet is hot. She says, Chris, these are hot. I can remember her saying hot, the word hot, right? I'm like, sure they are, Mom. Sure they are. So she ushers me out of the room. She goes to take care of something with somebody else, ignoring me. What do? In my youthful ignorance, I walk up to that cookie sheet. I look around the door. Boom! I stick my hands up there, and my fingertips get seared to the hot cookie sheet that was moments out of the oven. Did you see the smoke sizzling? Why? Because this is what children typically have to do. We have to understand it in order to be obedient. But with Christ, that is not so. When Christ rules in our home, a child can be obedient without understanding because the trust and the compassion and the love that they feel goes, you know what? I don't need to know where we're going. I don't need to know where this is heading because I know you and I know you want what's great for me regardless of what I think. And that can happen. Now, the little beggar like me is a sinful dude. It's not always going to happen, right? It didn't always happen, but it can. Look at your text. It says, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Ephesians, he says the same thing. Children, obey your parents in the Lord because this is right. He says, honor your father and mother. This is what we're to do as kids, right? Regardless of whether or not we think they're smart, we think they're stupid, we think they're anything. It can be done without understanding because Christ rules, right? The Bible says this, Proverbs 3:5. We experience this. If you ever think that your child is alone in their rogueness, I want you to realize that they learned that rogueness from you. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. How do we know that kids can obey without understanding? Because when we're trusting in the Lord, it can happen. Does it happen to you? Does it happen to me? Are we always trusting in the Lord and everything, or do we quickly run to our own understanding, right? So that's the first level, that thing that happens in this second level of relational change, is our kids have the ability in Christ to do something, to obey without understanding. And then the second aspect of that, it leads towards parenting. Now, how do we respond, regardless of if our kid is obeying or not? And notice what he does. He addresses the dad here, okay? He says, fathers, and I would say this, when Christ rules, fathers can parent their children without tyranny. Now, he places this on dads, right? He doesn't say fathers and mothers. Notice the text, he says fathers. And I believe this is really important because dads, I'm going to make a statement. Dads are very, very important. Can I tell you, if you don't believe me, if you're a single mom, I am all for you. I would love you. I want to help you. I want to be there for you. I want our church to come around you. But if you ever want to see what is, how our world, how Satan has affected our world, okay, you look at the divorce rate and you look at what happens to dads in the midst of that. What typically happens? The kids go to mom and not dad because our world has said that that's better. Let me ask you a question. When our world says something is better, what should you do? You shouldn't go, oh, well, it must be the best. Because the world that is so wonderful has said so. Now we should go, hang on, why? Why that? There's nothing wrong in that respect other than it takes dad out of the picture. And I believe dads are very important to their children. And I've said this before. I'm going to say it. Just sprinkle a pound or two of salt on this, would you? I'm going to say this. I'm going to say I think dads in the development of their children when they're in their adolescent age are more important. Not better. It doesn't mean moms are inferior. Yeah, I said it. It's on tape, isn't it? I think that dads are more important because of the authority that they bring, the leadership that they bring into the lives of those kids. If you have something in your world that has been different than that, I love you. I am not judging you for what you've done. I am not here to judge this world. God is the judge. But I've just watched it through 19 years of doing student ministry. And I could see when dads weren't around, when dads advocated their responsibility and pitched it to someone else, to the youth pastor, to the mom, to somebody else to step in and to love and to guide. We often saw those kids not do this, but do this. Were you one of those kids? It might have been you, right? You may have had that experience. Look at the text. Notice what he says. He says, fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. That's what happens when dads lead tyrannically. You know what a tyrant is? You know what a tyrant is? A tyrant is somebody who comes into the world and it's his way or the highway. And we think, well, as parents, shouldn't it be that way? Shouldn't he just obey or she obey what I say? No. Yes, they're called to do that, but as a parent, we don't lead with do this or get out. Live this or go. That's called tyranny. There's a form of loving and parenting that comes that doesn't have to cost that. Doesn't have to bring that cost to the table because that cost will bankrupt a family, right? Comes with understanding so that the kid is not now so frustrated with their life that they're ready to just bail. I'm out of here. I can tell you how many kids I've watched go through high school and when they got free, in other words, out of mom and dad's house, what did they do? They went off and they just indulged because they did not have any more foundation, because they're out from under the tyrant. And that's what he's saying here. As fathers, our job is not to be the tyrant in our home. There should be a conversation that is had. Parents, when you have had conversations with your kids, when there has been on any issue, open dialogue where your kid is now communicating with you. Dads, when you have sat down and had discussions with your kids, sometimes they end up in fights, right? Because we're sinful, right? But ultimately, have those conversations worked out to build a deeper love and trust with your kid? Every single time. That's the way it's supposed to be. I always tell parents, keep the avenue and the channel of communication open so that your kid will always know they can come back, right? Always know that they can come back to you with their issues and their problems. All right, let's look at the third level here. We're going to finish with this. The third level, we've walked down from parents to kids. And now this is a little more controversial. How do we act in our world when there's authority and subordinate relationships that have to happen? And notice the context that he uses here. And I say the working relationship. That's what I've called this. How does Christ affect our working relationship? And the reason is because I'm universalizing the truth that he's saying here. Does that make sense? There is a specific truth in this text that he is saying to the church at Colossae about slaves and masters. And that is, I don't want to take that out of context. But then there is, how do we use it? We don't have slaves in our culture and haven't for over 150 years. How do we use this text? And this is how I say we use it. Because there's other places in the Bible that show us how we are to be to our authorities and subordinates in the working relationship. So that's the next level, is working, right? The first thing you see here is slaves can obey their masters with sincerity. And notice in this, verse 22 through 25, and all of the other parts of the text, he gave us a single verse, right? Wives, be subject to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Children, obey your parents. Fathers, don't exasperate your kids. Single verses, right? And notice right here, he puts 22, 23, 24, and 25 together, all around the context of the slave. Now, I would say this. I believe, contextually, that this was an issue at the church in Colossae, right? We know this from other books. We know this from Philemon. We know this from other books regarding this. I think that slavery was an issue. I think it was specifically on Paul's heart when you have Philemon and Onesimus who are in this church, who are here. I think it was a big deal. So he's bringing it up specifically for them. But I want us to see how that reflects to us. Because every one of us is a slave to somebody. Every one of us is subordinate to somebody. So I have a tattoo. My tattoo I get asked about all the time because I made it in a place that's visible. If you don't agree with that, I love you. That's okay. I don't agree with it either. It's a bad idea. Don't tell your kid. I can't tell you how many kids are going, I'm going to get a tattoo because of you. Right? The reason I got it is because I constantly needed a reminder. I am an arrogant man. I am a pride-filled man. If I can do it on my own, I will. And I need a constant reminder of my slavery to Christ. And that's what it means. It means slave. I'm a slave. That's all I am. And in this context, I take that to you. I'm your slave, right? As much as I'm Christ, I'm a slave to you. I'm your servant. Look at how we are to be as slaves. In all things, verse 22, obey those who are your masters on earth. Wow. How do you do that? I want us to go back 2,000 years. How do you do that? This is a socioeconomic slavery. This isn't a racial slavery like we had in the U.S. It's a little different. This is based off of where a person was in the stratus or in the caste system. How do you do that? Your family has been taken as a slave, disgruntled, angry, upset. Your family has been taken from you. You're alone. How do we do that? How do you obey without being upset? Notice where he takes it. He says, not with external service, as those who are merely pleasing men. In other words, not just lip service. It's not like, don't just get the job done to the minimalist extent. Sometimes I'll ask Jovi to do something. Quinn does this too, but Quinn has figured out that if you want to avoid the second lecture, just do it really well the first time and you're okay. Jovi hadn't figured that one out yet. She's like me. And Jovi will do something and it'll be just barely done. Could you put these clothes in the drawer? Yes. She pulls out all the drawers, puts the clothes in them. Drawers are all still out. Let's walk away. I did what you said. Second lecture. Sweetheart, could you shut the drawers? Or get a beating? No. That's what he's talking about. Yeah, I'm your slave, but you're not going to, because I'm a slave, I'm just going to do what I have to do to get out of here. You ever had a job like that? I used to work as a waiter growing up in college. Oh my gosh, get the floor done at the end of the night, clean the table off. Just get out, right? You were just done. But notice what he says. He gives us two qualifiers. We are to obey, and now he gives us the second qualifier, as slaves. He says, with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. So you have obedience that comes not just with the external lip service, not just with merely pleasing men, but with sincerity in heart. And notice who's the qualifier there, fearing the Lord. I want to take you back. He says, as is fitting for the Lord in our parenting and our submission, in the Lord as parents to children and fathers to our children. And now he says, as is fearing the Lord. He brings God back into every one of these relationships because we have to say when Christ rules, right? We have to say when He rules. So now look at the second part. You've got obedience. He says, and whatever you do your work with heartily. You know what that word heartily means? From your soul. Okay, stop for a second. What do you love on this earth? What do you love to do? You ever had anybody say, get a job that you love? Well, that's a hard thing. Sometimes you have opportunities and you need to take them and we just need to live, right? Some of us don't get the opportunity just to do what we love. Some of you do. But I'll say it this way, it doesn't matter, but that's the concept. When somebody does what they love to do, you know what they're doing it from? They're doing it from their soul, right? You ever been in that spot? If you like to bike and you go biking, you're doing it from your soul, right? When I get on the basketball court, which I haven't done in years, and I touch a basketball, it's like I'm doing it from my soul all of a sudden, heartily. I would easily, yes, give me the ball, let's go play. From my soul. You see where that's coming from? Notice what he says, do you work heartily as for the Lord? Brings the Lord back in, not for men. How do slaves obey? How do they obey masters with sincerity? Because God is who they're working for. God is who they're doing their job for. At camp, at the end of after every meal, we had what's known as a scraper. And the kids sat around the table, and at the end of the meal, all these plates with food on it had to be dealt with. You couldn't just take it up there and give it to somebody else to deal with your mess. No, what we did was we had a scraper game, because it's camp. We would play a game to figure out who's going to have to scrape everybody's plates. And you know those kids didn't like that. They're at camp scraping plates. So they scrape all the plates onto one plate, and then they take that one plate back there, and they give it to somebody, and that person scrapes it into a big thing, and they take to pigs. It's awesome. They feed the pigs with all the food at camp. Point is, that scraper game, what do you think the plates look like the first part of the week? They were ugly. food on the table. Mess is made. Kids just trying to get through with it. This is not from my soul, is it? What do you think the plates looked like at the end of the week when kids' hearts were being changed by Christ? What do you think kids were doing? You think kids were having to play the scraper game to find out who does it? Sometimes it's a lot of fun, and we made it great. But sometimes, you know what you get? You get kids going, I'll do it. I'll scrape the plates. Let me do it. What? What is happening? It's when Christ is now ruling. You see that? The work is done heartily as unto the Lord. Keep looking. Verse 24, knowing that from the Lord you have received the reward of the inheritance. In other words, you're not looking to your master to go, good job, buddy. Here's a bonus. Way to go. Man, this floor looks better than I've ever seen it. You have done a fantastic job. Wouldn't that be great if all bosses were that way? But they're not. Are they? They're not. So how do we work in the midst of that? Are we only working, when you pat me on the back, I'll do a good job. I'm not doing a good job till you pat me on the back. No, that's not how we do, right? Slaves don't work that way. We work with sincerity, heartily, through obedience. We work. Keep going. Our inheritance is coming from the Lord. It is the Lord whom you serve, verse 25. Notice how he flips it. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and without partiality. Who do you think he's talking to there? You think he's talking to the slave? Or you think he's talking to the master? It's probably both, right? Because the very next thing he says, and this flips into chapter 4. I love how chapter 4, verse 1, honestly should be in chapter 3. But look at chapter 4, verse 1. He says, Masters, grant your slaves justice. Right after that text. The master's job now is to, no matter how that slave is acting, if he's acting obedient or not, does that change how the master is to be towards his slave? Towards those who are working under him? Absolutely not. Why? He should give them fairness. He should give them justice. And I say he should do it in humility. Look at the last part of verse 1. Knowing that you too have a master. Where? In heaven. He's watching you. He's in you. He is in you. He's put His Spirit in you. And how can we treat others without justice and fairness who are under us? How can we manipulate the situation to make me richer and better looking in the eyes of the ones above me? How do we do that when Christ is in us? And He's our master and He's been so good. So the idea here, at the end of this, is that when our minds have been affected by Christ and our heart has been bent towards others and is being affected by what He's doing, as we're loving Him more, we're loving others more. Now our relationships can be mended.